The folded paper trembled between Alfred Holloway's calloused fingers as he pressed it into Dorothy Fletcher's hands, his dark eyes burning with something she had never seen in them before, not defiance, not arrogance, not the cold amusement he usually wore like armor. What she saw now was rawness, an aching vulnerability that cracked through every hard line of his face. "This was yours," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that had always made her pulse stutter. "Before anyone tampered with it, before your uncle signed his name across the bottom, before Judge Harlan pressed his seal into the wax, before any of it, this was yours." Dorothy stared down at the deed in her hands. The paper was yellowed at the edges, worn soft from being hidden for what must have been years, folded and refolded in some dark, secret place. Fletcher Creek Ranch, 2,000 acres in the Cimarron Valley. Her father's handwriting in the top corner, unmistakable, looping letters she had memorized as a child, tracing them with her fingertip while he laughed at her bedside. Registered in the name of Dorothy Ann Fletcher, his only daughter, his only heir. Her throat locked around the words she needed to say. "Where did you get this?" she finally managed. Alfred Holloway, outlaw, wanted man, the most feared rider in 3 counties, straightened his spine and looked at her the way a man looks at something he knows he is about to lose. Pride and grief tangled together in the set of his jaw. "I took it back," he said simply, "the way I take most things." And then the sheriff's men came thundering down the ridge, and everything exploded into chaos, and Dorothy Fletcher clutched that deed to her chest and ran, and the story of how they had arrived at this single devastating moment began to unspool behind her eyes like smoke from a dying fire. It had started 6 months ago, in the worst autumn that the Kansas Territory had seen in a decade. Dorothy had come back to Cimarron Crossing on the stage from Wichita, her black mourning dress smelling of camphor and grief, her father's death certificate folded inside her traveling case beside the single letter that had summoned her home. She was 24 years old, and she had not expected to feel this hollow. She had prepared herself for grief. She had not prepared herself for the particular ugliness that follows a rich man's death when the vultures are already circling before the body is cold. The town had changed in the 3 years she had been away at the Wichita Academy for Young Ladies, where she had learned to read French novels and play the pianoforte and conduct herself with the kind of dignified composure that was supposed to make a woman marriageable. What the academy had not taught her, she was rapidly discovering, was how to navigate the treacherous legal labyrinth that was frontier land inheritance in the year 1878. Cimarron Crossing had grown. There was a new hotel on the main street, a telegraph office, and a land registry building that gleamed with fresh white paint as though it were proud of itself. She noticed that the land registry building was directly across from the office of one Silas Fletcher, her uncle, whose name had always made her father's expression go carefully blank whenever it came up. She stepped off the stage into the dry October wind and looked around for her father's foreman, old Pete Mabry, who had written her the letter. He was not there. Instead, there was a man she did not recognize, well-dressed for Cimarron, in a dark coat and good boots, with pale eyes and a smile that showed too many teeth. "Miss Fletcher," he said, sweeping his hat off his head with practiced graciousness. "Welcome home. I'm afraid Pete Mabry took ill last week. I'm representing your Uncle Silas. My name is Raymond Cass, and I've been engaged to help settle the matter of your father's estate." Dorothy looked at Raymond Cass and heard every alarm bell in her body begin to ring. "What matter?" she said carefully. "My father's will was drawn up in 1874. The ranch passes to me. There is no matter to settle." Raymond Cass smiled the smile of a man who is holding all the cards and knows it. "I'm afraid there may be some complications," he said. The complications, as she would learn over the following 2 weeks, were catastrophic. Her Uncle Silas had filed a counterclaim to the Fletcher Creek Ranch, arguing that her father, William Fletcher, had signed a bill of sale transferring the property to Silas Fletcher 3 months before his death. A bill of sale that bore her father's signature and the seal of Judge Harlan Beaumont. the most powerful legal authority in Cimarron County. Dorothy sat across from her uncle in his office on a cold November afternoon and looked at the document Raymond Cass laid before her, and she felt something go very still inside her. "That is not my father's signature," she said quietly. Silas Fletcher was a lean, angular man of 52 who had always reminded Dorothy of a dried-out creek bed, the kind that looks harmless until the flash floods come. He smiled at her now with something that might have been regret if it were not so clearly calculated. "Dorothy, I understand this is difficult. Your father and I had our differences, but he was still my brother and I grieve him. But he was in poor health those last months. He was not always thinking clearly. This document is legal and binding. Judge Beaumont has already ruled on the matter." "You forged his signature," Dorothy said. The smile did not waver. "That is a very serious accusation, my dear. One that could cause you a great deal of trouble in this town." She left his office with her hands shaking and walked 3 blocks to the law office of the only attorney in Cimarron Crossing who had not yet been bought by her uncle's money. A young man named Elias Webb, 26, who was earnest and clever and entirely outmatched by the forces arrayed against Dorothy's claim. Elias spread the documents across his desk and studied them for a long time. Then he looked up at her with an expression that she was coming to recognize as the face people make when they are about to tell her that she is right and that it does not matter. "The signature is suspicious," he said carefully. "The pressure patterns are wrong. I've seen your father's correspondence and this does not match. But Miss Fletcher, Judge Beaumont has already ruled. To overturn his ruling, you would need either a higher court, which means going to Wichita, or you would need to find the original deed, the one your father filed when he first registered the ranch. If that document still exists, and if it contradicts the bill of sale, you might have grounds. Where would the original deed be?" Elias was quiet for a moment that stretched too long. "That's the problem," he said. "The land registry was broken into last spring. Several documents went missing. At the time, the sheriff ruled it petty theft." Now he stopped. "Now it looks rather less petty," Dorothy finished for him. She left Elias Webb's office and walked to the edge of town, to the place where the main street dissolved into the long brown prairie grass, and she stood there in the cold wind and thought about her father. She thought about him teaching her to ride. She thought about him standing at the fence of Fletcher Creek Ranch at sunset, his hands on the top rail, his face turned toward the horizon with that particular expression of a man who is grateful for what he has built. She thought about how he had told her, when she was 17 and being sent away to school, that the ranch would always be hers. "This land is your inheritance, Dorothy," he had said. "Nobody can take it from you." She had believed him. She had believed him completely. She was still standing at the edge of town when the shot rang out. It was not aimed at her. The shot came from the direction of the old stockyard on the south end of Cimarron Crossing, followed immediately by shouting, the thunder of horses, and the distinctive sound of a crowd of men doing something urgent and dangerous. Dorothy turned and watched as 3 riders came exploding out of an alley at full gallop, and half the town's residents surged into the street to watch, and Sheriff Claude Decker and his deputies came pouring out of the jailhouse with their guns drawn. One of the riders peeled away from the others and came thundering directly toward her. For one absurd, frozen moment, Dorothy stood in the middle of the road and stared at the horse bearing down on her, and then strong hands caught her by the waist and swung her clear, and she found herself pressed against a wooden storefront with a large, warm body between her and the stampeding hooves. The horse passed close enough that she could feel the displaced air move across her face. She looked up. The man who had pulled her clear was looking down at her, and for a moment neither of them moved. He was not what she would have expected from a man who had just dragged her out of the path of a runaway horse. He was tall, 30 years old or thereabouts, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had seen considerable weather. His jaw was rough with several days of beard, and there was a scar along the left side of his chin that looked like it had come from a blade. His eyes were very dark, almost black, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify: sharp, assessing, but not unkind. He had the look of a man who spent a great deal of time outdoors and not much time worrying about what other people thought of him. "You all right?" he said. "Perfectly fine," she said, because she had been trained to say perfectly fine even when she was not. He stepped back and looked at her for one more moment, and then Sheriff Decker's voice cut through the chaos. "Holloway, get your hands where I can see them." The man with the dark eyes went very still. Something changed in his expression. The openness shuddered. The careful mask came back up, and what replaced it was something so self-possessed and controlled that it was almost theatrical. "Sheriff," he said pleasantly, and turned around with his hands away from his body in the specific way of a man who has done this before and is not particularly alarmed by it. Dorothy pressed herself back against the wall and watched Alfred Holloway. She had heard the name even in Wichita, had heard it the way you hear thunderstorms approaching on a clear day, stand easy in the street, while Claude Decker came toward him with 3 deputies and a shotgun. "You're a long way from your usual territory," the sheriff said. "Just passing through," Alfred Holloway said. "Happened to stop a lady from getting herself trampled. Thought that was the kind of thing a man was supposed to do. The kind of thing a man was supposed to do does not generally involve robbing the Cimarron Trust and Savings this morning." "I have no idea what you're referring to," Alfred said, still pleasant, still easy, still that particular quality of calm that suggested he had calculated every exit from this conversation and found at least 3 that suited him. Dorothy should have walked away. Every reasonable instinct she possessed told her to move quietly off in the other direction and have nothing further to do with any of this. Instead, she heard herself say, clearly and loudly enough to carry, "He was with me." The entire street went quiet. She looked at Alfred Holloway and he looked at her, and something passed between them that was entirely wordless surprise on his part, and on her part the strange, slightly giddy sensation of having done something completely impulsive for the first time in several years. "That right," Sheriff Decker said, looking at her with flat eyes. "He came to my aid when those horses came through," Dorothy said. "He was standing here when I arrived, perhaps 15 minutes ago. I am Dorothy Fletcher, and my father was William Fletcher of Fletcher Creek Ranch, and I would be happy to provide this statement in writing if that is required." The Fletcher name still meant something in Cimarron Crossing. She watched the sheriff calculate the cost of pressing the matter against the weight of the Fletcher name, and find that the arithmetic did not favor him, at least not today, at least not in the middle of the main street with the whole town watching. He looked at Alfred Holloway for a long moment. Alfred Holloway looked pleasantly back. "Stay in my county much longer," the sheriff said, "and I will find a reason." He walked away. His deputies followed. Dorothy let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Alfred Holloway turned to look at her again. This time the expression was different, not assessing, not calculating, but genuinely curious. And something else, something that she would not allow herself to name immediately, something that moved in the air between them like static before a lightning strike. "That was a dangerous thing to do," he said. "I suspect you do dangerous things every day," she said. "At least mine didn't involve robbing a bank." "I already told the sheriff." "I know what you told the sheriff," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something that surprised her entirely. He laughed. It was a short laugh, genuine and unguarded, and it changed the whole shape of his face. "Alfred Holloway," he said. "Dorothy Fletcher," she replied. "I know," he said. "I knew your father." The words landed with a weight she had not expected. She looked at him more carefully, trying to reconcile this man wanted in 3 counties, accused of robbery before noon on a Tuesday, with anything her father might have said to her. She could not find the fit, but something in the steadiness of his expression told her it was true. "My father never mentioned you," she said. "No," Alfred said quietly. "He wouldn't have. I wasn't the kind of person fathers generally mention to their daughters." He paused. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man. She wanted to ask him what he meant, how he had known her father, what connected them. But at that moment old Pete Mabry came limping around the corner looking flushed and apologetic and full of excuses for having been delayed. And when Dorothy looked back, Alfred Holloway was gone. She did not see him again for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, her situation grew considerably worse. Elias Webb filed a challenge to her uncle's bill of sale with the county court, and Judge Beaumont dismissed it within 48 hours. Raymond Cass began showing up at the boarding house where Dorothy was staying, Mrs. Aldrich's place on 2nd Street, with papers that required her signature, papers that she refused to sign. Her uncle sent her a letter suggesting that perhaps they could come to some arrangement that might benefit them both, which Dorothy read twice and then burned in the boarding house grate. She moved through those weeks in a state of controlled fury that she was very careful to keep controlled. She wrote letters to a law firm in Wichita. She wrote a letter to the Kansas Territorial Governor's office. She spoke to every old-timer in Cimarron Crossing who had known her father and might remember something about the original land registration. She spent 3 hours one afternoon in the company of old Mrs. Hargrove, who had been the registrar's secretary for 20 years, trying to piece together what might have happened to the original deed. Mrs. Hargrove, who was 70 and had opinions about absolutely everything, poured Dorothy another cup of tea and said, very quietly, "The original deed did exist. I typed the copy myself in 1869. Your father registered that land before Silas Fletcher had a penny to his name." She paused. "The break-in at the registry last spring. They took a whole drawer of documents. Whoever broke in knew exactly where to look." "Do you know who broke in?" Dorothy asked. Mrs. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Dorothy understood she did know, or at least suspected. "There was a man seen in town the week before the break-in," Mrs. Hargrove said finally. "Tall fellow, dark hair, goes by the name of Crane. He works for various people, if you take my meaning. Not the kind of man who has permanent employers." Dorothy thanked her and left and went back to the boarding house and sat by her window looking out at the flat Kansas sky and tried to organize everything she knew into a shape that made sense. That was the night Alfred Holloway knocked on her window. She was not asleep. It was past 10 o'clock and she was still sitting at her small writing desk with the lamp turned low, going over her notes, when the soft double tap came from the window. She looked up. He was there on the other side of the glass, his hat gone, his dark eyes catching the lamplight, looking not dangerous but urgent. She opened the window. "I need to talk to you," he said. "You could have used the door," she said, though she kept her voice down. "Not with Cass watching the front of this building," he said. "He's been here the last 2 nights." She had not known that. She felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the November air. "Come in," she said, quickly. He climbed through the window with the particular efficiency of a man who had climbed through a great many windows, and stood in her small room looking somewhat larger than the room wanted him to be, taking in the papers spread across her desk with quick, intelligent eyes. "I know about the deed," he said. She went very still. "How?" He reached into his coat and took out a folded piece of paper. "Because I have it." She stared at him. "Not the original," he said quickly. "A copy. One your father made himself before he was ill. He gave it to me for safekeeping." He said. Alfred paused, and something moved across his face like a cloud shadow moving across open ground. "He said that if anything happened to him, and if you were ever in trouble with the land, I should find you. He knew Silas couldn't be trusted. He'd known it for years." Dorothy sat down on the edge of her bed because her legs had decided they were done standing for the moment. "My father trusted you," she said. "It was not quite a question." "Your father trusted very few people," Alfred said. "I was one of them. I know what that cost him, given what I am. I know it doesn't look good, me coming to you like this, a man with my reputation." He set the folded paper down on the desk beside her lamp. "But I made him a promise, and I keep my promises, whatever else I am." She looked at the copy of the deed. She looked at him. She was a woman who had been trained in composure and careful judgment, but she had also been trained to read people, and what she read in Alfred Holloway at this moment was not deception. It was something painfully honest, the particular honesty of a man who does not try to make himself better than he is. "How did you know my father?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark street before he answered. "When I was 19, he said, I made a very bad decision. I fell in with a gang of men who were robbing cattle drives out of Abilene. Your father caught us on his land and he had every right to shoot us and leave us for the crows. Instead, he separated me from the others, looked at me for a long time and said, 'You're too young to be this stupid.' Go home." Alfred paused. "I didn't have a home to go to. He let me work the ranch for 2 seasons. He was the first person who ever treated me like I might be worth something. And then," Dorothy said softly, "and then I made more bad decisions," he said without self-pity. "That is the short version of the next 10 years. She did not press him. There would be time for those questions later, or perhaps there would not be. But either way, she found that what he had said was enough to make sense of the inexplicable thing she felt sitting here in this small room with this wanted man at 10:30 on a November night. Not fear. Not exactly. But something that was the opposite of indifference. "The copy is not enough on its own," she said, because she had trained herself to address the practical problem first. "I need the original, or I need proof that the bill of sale was forged. Without that, Elias Webb says we cannot overturn Judge Beaumont's ruling." "I know," Alfred said. "The original deed exists. I know where it is." "How?" His jaw tightened. "Because the man who stole it, a man named Crane who works for hire, I know him. I know his territory. And last month I had a conversation with someone who was in a position to tell me things." He looked at her steadily. "It's in a strongbox in your uncle's house, room at the back behind the bookcase." Dorothy felt the cold, clean precision of it settle over her. The original deed, hidden in her uncle's house. The thing that could end all of this, that could give her back what was rightfully hers. "That's breaking and entering," she said. "Yes," Alfred agreed. "You're telling me we have to steal it back." "I'm telling you I can steal it back," he said. "You should stay well away from the actual act. What I need from you is a reason for you to visit your uncle's house. A reason to be there in the early evening when the household is occupied in the front rooms." She thought about it. "His housekeeper has a sister who attends my church. I could manufacture a social call, an attempt to discuss the estate peacefully. Silas would want to believe I was backing down. It would appeal to his vanity." Alfred looked at her the way he had looked at her on that first day in the street, assessing and curious and something else, something warmer. "You're quick," he said. "My father taught me to be," she said. They sat across from each other in her small lamplit room and worked out the plan together, and Dorothy was aware the entire time of the particular quality of the silence between them, when they were not talking, full and charged and careful. The silence of two people being very deliberate about how close they were willing to come to something they were not naming yet. It took them 4 days to arrange it. Dorothy sent a carefully worded note to her uncle suggesting a meeting. Elias Webb was kept completely in the dark. He was too honest to be useful in this, and too worried about her to be silent about it. Mrs. Aldrich at the boarding house was told that Dorothy had a church function and would be out late. On a cold Thursday evening in mid-November, Dorothy Fletcher sat in her Uncle Silas's parlor drinking terrible tea and being gracious, while Alfred Holloway, somewhere at the back of the house, was doing things she was trying very hard not to think about. Silas Fletcher was in an excellent mood. He had taken her note as exactly the capitulation she had intended him to read into it, and he was being magnanimous in a way that made her stomach turn. He talked about the ranch, about his plans to expand the cattle operation, about how he knew she would land on her feet. She was a Fletcher after all. Raymond Cass was there too, leaning against the far wall, watching her with those pale eyes that never quite warmed. She stayed for 45 minutes. She made small talk about the weather and the difficulty of traveling in November. She accepted a second cup of the terrible tea. And then she said she must be getting back before dark, thanked them both with a smile she would later rank among the greatest performances of her life, and walked out of the house. She walked 3 blocks down and turned into the alley beside Hendrick's hardware store and stood with her back against the wall, heart hammering, and waited. Alfred appeared out of the shadows 10 minutes later. He was not, she noted, carrying anything visibly, which told her either he had failed or he was cleverer than she had realized about where he put things. "Well," she said. He reached inside his coat and took out a flat leather folder. Even in the dim alley light, she could see the official seal on the top of the document inside it. He held it out to her and she took it, and with hands that were not entirely steady, she opened it and read the top line. Fletcher Creek Ranch. 2,000 acres. Registered in the name of Dorothy Ann Fletcher, her father's handwriting in the top corner exactly as she had always known it. "That's not all," Alfred said, his voice very quiet. "There was something else in the strongbox, a letter, from Crane to your uncle dated last March. It describes the arrangement in detail, what Crane was paid to steal and what was to be done with the original deed. It names Judge Beaumont as a co-conspirator. He produced a second document. This is evidence of fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and judicial corruption. With this, Elias Webb can take the case directly to the territorial court in Wichita and skip Judge Beaumont entirely." Dorothy stared at the 2 documents in her hands. Then she looked up at Alfred, and what she saw in his face in that moment undid something careful and armored inside her pride and something that hurt, and the look of a man who has just done the best thing he has ever done in his life and knows that it will cost him. "Alfred," she said. "Don't," he said, and the word was very gentle. "Don't thank me. I made your father a promise and I kept it, that's all." "That is not all," she said. He said nothing, and the silence between them in that dark alley was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She had Elias Webb in her sitting room at 7 the next morning. He read both documents 3 times, his eyes growing progressively wider and progressively more alarmed in the way that excellent news delivered by impossible means tends to alarm cautious young lawyers. "Miss Fletcher," he said carefully when he had finished reading. "I have to ask you, the documents came to me through a trusted source," Dorothy said firmly. "They are genuine. I am willing to swear to that. How they came to you will be a question the territorial court may ask. Let them ask. The contents of those documents speak for themselves, Elias. Crane's letter names Beaumont by his full name and describes exactly what was done and why. The original deed predates the bill of sale by 9 years. The bill of sale is fraud." Elias folded his hands on his desk and looked at her for a long moment. He was young and earnest and genuinely cared about doing what was right, and she could see the conflict in him between those qualities and his lawyer's instinct for self-preservation. "If I file this in Wichita," he said, "Judge Beaumont will know immediately. Your uncle will know. There could be repercussions." "I am aware," Dorothy said. "File it." He filed it that afternoon. The repercussions came within 48 hours, and they were worse than Dorothy had imagined. Her room at Mrs. Aldrich's was searched while she was out, subtly enough that someone careless might not have noticed, but Dorothy was not careless. 2 of her letters from the Wichita law firm went missing from her case. Raymond Cass appeared at Elias Webb's office and delivered what Elias described to her as a strongly worded suggestion that the filing be withdrawn. And on Saturday night, someone set a small fire at the back of the building where Elias kept his offices. The fire was caught before it did serious damage, but the message was clear. Dorothy went to Alfred. She had not known precisely where to find him. He had told her, before they parted in the alley, that he would be at the old Beaufort trading post on the edge of town if she needed to reach him. But he had said it casually, as though he were not sure she would ever need to. She rode out there on Sunday morning on a borrowed horse, wrapped in her heavy wool coat against the December cold, and found him outside the trading post splitting wood with the focused economy of a man who does not waste movement. He looked up when he heard her horse and set the axe down, and the way he looked at her, the immediate attention, The concern that moved through his expression before he could stop it told her something she was not ready to think about yet. She told him about the search, the fire, Cass's visit to Elia's. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to appreciate about him. A great many men, she had found, interrupted. "Beaumont knows the filing is in Wichita," Alfred said when she was done. "He'll be trying to intercept it. He has contacts with the court clerk's office." "How do you know that?" He gave her a slight, dry look that was as close to embarrassed as she had ever seen him. "I pay attention to who the corrupt judges are friendly with," he said. "It's useful information in my line of work." "Your line of work," she repeated, and there was the thing she had been carrying for weeks, the question of what exactly she was doing, spending all her time with a man whose occupation was robbing banks and evading the law. She had thought about it in the careful, rational part of her mind every night, and every morning she had gotten up and gone back to him anyway, and she was starting to understand that the careful, rational part of her mind had lost this particular argument. "Dorothy," Alfred said quietly. "I know what you are," she said. "I'm not pretending otherwise, I need to know that you are not going to disappear before this is over." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going anywhere. People say that." "I know," a pause. "I'm not people," she believed him. That was the dangerous, intoxicating, slightly terrifying thing. She believed him completely, in the way she had not believed anyone in a very long time. They stood in the cold winter morning with the sound of the wind in the dry grass around them, and she was aware that they had moved somehow into different territory, that the practical alliance they had built was no longer the only thing between them, and that he was aware of it too. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the folded copy of the deed, the one he had given her that first night, her father's copy, made in his own hand. "Keep this for me," she said. "If anything happens to me, keep it safe and get it to Elia's." He took it from her hand. Their fingers touched briefly, and the current of it moved through her like cold water. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. "You can't promise that." "No," he agreed, "but I can make it very difficult for anyone who tries." The next 2 weeks were the most frightening and the most vivid of Dorothy Fletcher's life. She stayed in Cimarron Crossing. She refused to be pushed out. Every morning she walked to Elias Webb's office and they worked through the documents together, building the case that would go before the territorial court. Every evening, Alfred was somewhere nearby. Not always visible, not always announcing himself, but present in the particular way that only a man with very specific skills could be present, watchful, alert, keeping the space around her safe in ways she only occasionally glimpsed. Her uncle sent her 2 more letters. The first was another attempt at settlement. The second was a legal threat, filed through Raymond Cass's office, claiming that the documents she had produced were stolen property and that she should be charged accordingly. The territorial court clerk in Wichita, apparently less corruptible than Judge Beaumont had counted on, declined to receive the counterclaim and certified the original filing. Judge Beaumont suspended his judicial calendar and sent a letter to Wichita on official stationery. The territorial court sent a letter back instructing him to make himself available for inquiry. Dorothy read the territorial court's letter to Elias and felt, for the first time in months, something close to hope. She told Alfred that evening. He was at the trading post again. She had fallen into the habit of riding out there in the late afternoon on the days when the world felt too closed in, which was most days, and she read him the letter and watched the relief move through him, visible in his shoulders, in the set of his mouth. "It's not over yet," he said. "I know, but it's moving." He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the trading post's small iron stove and handed her one, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight, and she thought about how strange it was that this had become comfortable, this specific configuration of herself and this man in this rough, cold place, when 6 weeks ago they had been complete strangers. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "What do you remember about it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking into his coffee, and she watched something soft and unexpectedly young move across his face. "The creek used to run clear," he said. In early summer, when the snowmelt came down from the Colorado mountains. Your father had a kitchen garden that your mother had started, and he kept it going after she died. Terrible gardener, your father, kept it anyway. He paused. There was a bay horse he was particularly proud of. Named her Tuesday for no reason he ever explained. Dorothy laughed, a real laugh, the first one in months that felt entirely unguarded. I know Tuesday. She had a white blaze and an attitude. Alfred smiled, and there was that thing again, the way his face changed, the way the hard edges of him softened into something that reminded her this was a person who had once been a young man who made a bad decision and needed someone to believe he was worth saving. She did, he said. She bit me twice, and I was impressed by her on both occasions. They sat in the easy, warm silence after the laughter, and it was in that silence that Dorothy became fully, finally, irrevocably aware of what had been building between them since the moment he had pulled her out of the street in October. Not gratitude, not obligation, not the kind of misplaced attachment that forms under pressure and dissolves when the pressure lifts. Something steadier and larger than all of those things. Something that had been quietly constructing itself out of every conversation, every shared silence, every moment of honesty between them. She looked at him across the rough table in the lamplight, and he looked back at her, and for once neither of them was managing it or careful about it, and the thing that had been building was just there, plain and enormous between them. I don't know how to, she started. I know, he said. You don't know what I was going to say. Yes, I do, he said, and his voice had that low, steady quality that moved through her like resonance through still water. And I don't know either. She reached across the table very slowly and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and that was all, and it was considerable. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for the second week of January, 1879. Elias Webb took the stage to Wichita carrying the original deed, Crane's letter, and a detailed affidavit from Mrs. Hargrove, who had turned out to be ferociously willing to testify now that the tide appeared to be turning. Dorothy stayed in Cimarron Crossing. What she did not know, and would not know until it was nearly too late, was that Raymond Cass had been making arrangements of a different kind. Cass had discovered, through means she never fully traced, that Alfred Holloway was connected to her case, not just passingly, not just as the man who had pulled her from the street, but deeply, centrally, as the person who had recovered the stolen documents. He had also discovered, with the particular skill of a man who trafficked in secrets, that the documents were no longer in Alfred's possession. What Cass decided to do with this information was to use Alfred as leverage. On a cold Tuesday in late December, Dorothy received a visit at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house from a man she did not know, a short, sandy-haired man with a forgettable face who told her, in a voice so quiet it was almost respectful, that Alfred Holloway had been taken. He was being held at an undisclosed location. He would be turned over to the sheriff, who had outstanding warrants for him in 3 counties, unless Dorothy withdrew her filing from the territorial court and signed a document agreeing to the transfer of Fletcher Creek Ranch to her uncle Silas Fletcher. The man who delivered this message was clearly not comfortable delivering it, and Dorothy spent exactly 3 seconds reading him before she understood that he was not one of Cass's inner circle but a hired intermediary who probably knew very little beyond what he had been paid to say. "Tell me where he is," she said. The man blinked. "Miss, I don't think—" "You are a courier," Dorothy said, her voice very level. "You were given a message to deliver, and you have delivered it. Now I am going to ask you a question, and you are going to answer it, because I believe you are a man who has not yet done anything irreversible in this matter, and I believe you would like to keep it that way." He was quiet for a moment, and then he told her what she needed to know. Not everything. He did not know everything, but enough. She went to find Pete Mabry. Old Pete was the one person in Cimarron Crossing who had been her father's man for 30 years, and who had stayed loyal in the way that some people manage to stay loyal at great personal cost. He was also, she had come to understand over these months, a man who knew considerably more about the country around Cimarron Crossing than his arthritic walk and slow manner suggested. She told him what had happened. He listened with his hat in his hands and his eyes very still. "I know the Cardwell place," he said, when she had finished. "East of here about 8 miles. Been empty since old Cardwell died. Cass bought it last spring. Can you get me there?" He looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of old men who have watched young people make brave and dangerous decisions and have learned that the decisions will be made regardless. "I can get you there," he said. They went at night, which was Dorothy's insistence. She reasoned that whatever plan Cass had for Alfred would not be executed immediately, that he would wait for her response to his ultimatum, and that daylight travel on the road east would be more observed. Pete drove an unmarked wagon he borrowed from his neighbor, and Dorothy sat beside him wrapped in her heaviest coat with her father's old pistol in her pocket. She had learned to shoot when she was 12. Her father had insisted on it. She had not been a natural, but she had been stubborn, and she had gotten good enough that her father had said she would do. The Cardwell place was a low, dark farmhouse set back from a creek bed behind a stand of cottonwoods. There was a light in one window. There were 2 horses at the rail outside. Not enough, Dorothy thought, for a large operation, which meant Cass was either very confident or very careless. She and Pete circled wide around the house to the back. The back door was locked, but the lock was old, and Pete Mabry had 40 years of farming knowledge about old locks, and after a tense minute it opened. What Dorothy had expected to find was Alfred in some form of restraint in some back room, angry and perhaps injured, a situation requiring a rescue. What she actually found, when she crept through the dark farmhouse to the front room, was Alfred Holloway sitting at the kitchen table with his arms tied to the chair, entirely uninjured as far as she could see, and not in the least bit alarmed, engaged in what appeared to be a mildly contentious card game with the man who was guarding him. She stood in the doorway and stared. Alfred looked up and saw her, and his expression did something complicated: relief and exasperation, and something warmer, very quickly controlled. "Dorothy," he said, his voice even, "you should not be here." "You should not be tied to a chair," she said. "That is a fair point," the guard said, and threw down his cards. What followed was not, strictly speaking, a dramatic rescue. Pete Mabry was handy with a rope and a stern expression, and the guard, who turned out to be deeply underpaid and only intermittently committed to his current employer, showed very little inclination to escalate the situation when faced with a firm, elderly man and a young woman who was holding a pistol with the calm competence of someone who knew how to use it. Alfred was untied within 10 minutes. He stood up, rolled his shoulders, retrieved his hat from the corner of the room where someone had put it, and looked at Dorothy with an expression she had never seen on him before, something undefended and immediate that he had not quite managed to put away in time. "Pete," he said to the old man. "Alfred," Pete said, with the ease of men who have known each other for years, which apparently they had. Dorothy looked between them. "You know each other." "Your father's ranch, remember," Alfred said with a slight smile. Pete was there. She filed this away for later, which was where she was putting a great many things during this particular night, because what she needed to focus on right now was the next problem. "Cass knows where I live," she said. "When there is no response to his ultimatum by morning, he will not be in a position to do much," Alfred said. He glanced at the guard, who had accepted Pete's rope very philosophically and was sitting against the wall looking resigned. "Cass made a mistake. He came here tonight to check on things. He's in the barn." Dorothy blinked. "He's here. He arrived about an hour before you did," Alfred said. "I've been trying to work out how to get myself free without alerting him." He paused. "You have rather simplified matters." They went to the barn. Cass was there, apparently going through saddlebags by lamplight, and he looked up at the sound of the door and saw Alfred Holloway walking toward him free and unimpaired, and the calculation that moved across his face was almost elegant fear and assessment, and the beginning of a decision. And then he saw Dorothy behind Alfred and Pete Mabry behind Dorothy, and the math of the situation produced an answer that did not favor him. Alfred Holloway was very calm. He did not raise his voice. He explained, with precise economy, exactly what was going to happen next. Raymond Cass was going to write a full statement of his involvement in the conspiracy against Dorothy Fletcher, including the specific roles of Silas Fletcher and Judge Harlan Beaumont, or the territorial court in Wichita was going to receive additional documentation within the week that would make the fraud case considerably more personal for every party involved. Cass looked at Dorothy and Alfred Holloway for a long moment. He wrote the statement. They rode back to Cimarron Crossing in the dark, the three of them, and Dorothy held Cass's signed statement inside her coat against her heartbeat and felt the particular quality of exhaustion that comes after fear has run its course. Beside her, Alfred rode close enough that their horses were shoulder to shoulder, and in the dark she put her hand out and found his, and he held it without comment, without ceremony, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, and perhaps she thought it was. The territorial court convened in Wichita on January 14, 1879. Dorothy and Elias Webb arrived the day before by stage, accompanied by Mrs. Hargrove, whose testimony the court had specifically requested. Alfred did not go to Wichita. His presence there would have introduced complications that neither of them was willing to navigate yet, and there was a quiet, painful practicality to the decision that Dorothy thought about on the stage ride and did not let herself dwell on. He had given her the folded copy of the deed again before she left. "For luck," he said, standing by the stage in the cold morning light. She looked at him and thought about everything she wanted to say and knew this was not the time for any of it, and instead she put the deed in her inside coat pocket and said, "Be here when I get back." "I'll be here," he said. The hearing lasted 2 days. Elias was excellent, quiet, precise, methodical, building the case document by document with the attention to detail of a man who has prepared absolutely everything. Crane's letter naming Judge Beaumont was the centerpiece. The original deed was the foundation. Mrs. Hargrove's testimony about the theft of the registry documents and the period leading up to it provided the continuity. Cass's signed statement, which Elias had not expected and which reduced him briefly to speechlessness when Dorothy produced it, was what the territorial court called in its final ruling a decisive corroborating element. Judge Beaumont did not attend. His office sent a letter indicating that he was too unwell to travel. The territorial court's chief justice read this letter aloud with an expression of unmistakable skepticism. On January 16th, the territorial court ruled that the bill of sale purporting to transfer Fletcher Creek Ranch from William Fletcher to Silas Fletcher was fraudulent, that the original deed registered in 1869 remained the valid legal instrument, and that Dorothy Ann Fletcher was the lawful owner of Fletcher Creek Ranch, the full 2,000 acres in the Cimarron Valley, effective immediately. It also referred the matter of Judge Harlan Beaumont and the role of Silas Fletcher in the conspiracy to the territorial prosecutor's office. Dorothy sat in the gallery of the Wichita Territorial Court and heard the ruling and let out a breath that she had been holding since October, since the day she stepped off the stage in Cimarron Crossing and found that everything her father had left her had been stolen. She thought about her father. She thought about him standing at the fence at sunset, hands on the rail, the particular satisfaction of a man who trusts what he has built. She thought about how he had trusted Alfred Holloway with the most important document he had, trusted a young man who had made bad decisions because he believed that a person was more than the worst choice they had ever made. She put her hand inside her coat and felt the folded paper there. She went back to Cimarron Crossing. Alfred was there. He was at the trading post when she rode in on the afternoon of January 18th, and he came out of the building as she dismounted, and she looked at him and said, "It's done." And he closed the distance between them in 3 strides and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him with her forehead against his collarbone and let the weight of the last 3 months finally fall off her shoulders. He held her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and it was enough. But of course, with the land restored and the case resolved, the thing they had been circling came into full view, undeniable and enormous, and it was more complicated than a legal hearing. Alfred Holloway was a wanted man. She knew this. She had always known this. She had set it aside as a practical consideration while the case was still unresolved, which she acknowledged to herself was a form of willful avoidance. But now the case was resolved, and the thing she felt about this man was not going to fit neatly back into a practical category, no matter how hard she tried. They sat at the rough table in the trading post with the lamp between them, and for the first time in months there was nothing urgent pressing on the conversation, and that absence of urgency made the honest thing suddenly unavoidable. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at the table. He looked up at her. He was quiet for a long enough time that she understood he had been thinking about this, possibly for longer than she had. "I have been giving that considerable thought," he said, "and there is a man in Wichita," he said slowly, "a U.S. Marshal named Tate. I know him from several years ago, and the nature of our acquaintance is complicated but not entirely hostile. He's been looking for information about a man named Drummond, who runs a particularly unpleasant operation between here and the Colorado border. I happen to have that information." He paused. "If I give it to Tate, he has indicated, informally, that there might be room for negotiation regarding certain outstanding matters." Dorothy looked at him carefully. "You're talking about a deal." "I'm talking about a negotiation," he said, with the slight precision of a man being exact about words. "I don't know if it will work. Tate is a fair man, but he operates within the law, and the law is not always flexible." He met her eyes. "But I am going to try. Alfred, I know what I've been," he said quietly. "I know what the last 10 years look like written down on paper. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise or to wait for something that may not come." He stopped, and when he continued, his voice was lower and more careful. "I'm asking you to let me try to become the kind of man who can look at you without you having to look away from what I am." Dorothy stared at him. "I never look away from what you are," she said. "I know," he said. "You should." "I disagree with that entirely," she said, and her voice had more of herself in it than she had intended, more of the thing she had been managing since October, and she could see it land on him, see the thing it did to his expression. She reached across the table and took the folded deed out of her pocket, her father's copy, the one Alfred had given her for luck before she left for Wichita, the one she had brought back, and she laid it flat on the table between them. "My father left this with you," she said. "He trusted you with the most important thing he had. He told you to find me if I was ever in trouble." She looked at him. "He was a very perceptive man, my father." Alfred looked at the deed between them and then at her. "He was," he said. "So go to Wichita," she said. "Talk to Marshal Tate, try and come back." He went to Wichita. He was gone for 11 days, which were some of the longest 11 days Dorothy Fletcher had spent since she came back to Cimarron Crossing. She moved into the ranch house, her ranch house, during those 11 days. She opened the windows. She walked every acre. She found the kitchen garden her father had kept going in her mother's memory and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, about what she wanted to plant in the spring. She was in the kitchen garden on the morning of the 12th day, standing in the cold January sunlight with her hands in the pockets of her coat and her eyes on the horizon, when she heard the horse. She knew his horse's gait by now. She had learned it without meaning to, the way you learn things you pay attention to. She turned around. He was dismounting at the fence, and even at this distance she could see something different in how he was holding himself, not looser exactly, but less armored, as if something that had been braced against a blow for a very long time had, cautiously, stood upright. She walked toward him and he walked toward her, and they met at the fence, and the first thing he did was take the folded deed out of his coat pocket and hold it out to her. "This was yours," he said, his voice carrying everything he meant, the whole weight of it, the hidden deed and the hidden history and the hidden promise he had made her father and the hidden thing that had been growing between them since October. Before anyone tampered with it, this was yours. She took the deed from his hands. "What did Tate say?" she asked, though she was already reading the answer in his face. "He said," Alfred stopped, and there was something behind his eyes that was almost wonder, the expression of a man who has spent so long expecting the worst that he has forgotten what it looks like when things go differently. "He said that the information about Drummond was worth a great deal to him. He said that there were 2 outstanding warrants against me in Kansas territory that he had the authority to negotiate. He said that if I testify in the Drummond case, which goes to court in March, those 2 warrants will be dissolved. The 3rd warrant is Colorado territory, and that one is more complicated. But he believes it can be addressed through a formal petition with his support." He met her eyes. "It is not a complete resolution, not yet, but it is a beginning." "A beginning," she repeated. "I am very good at beginnings," he said. "It's the long middles I've historically had trouble with." She laughed again, that real, unguarded laugh that she was becoming less careful about around him. "Then it is fortunate that I am very good at middles." He looked at her, this man who had been her father's unlikely act of grace, her improbable protector, her conspirator in dark alleys and cold evenings, she let herself say it finally inside her own mind where there was no longer any point in being careful about it, the person she loved. "Dorothy," he said. "Alfred," she said. He reached up and put his hand along the side of her face, and she leaned into it, and he kissed her, there at the fence of Fletcher Creek Ranch in the January sunlight, and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like what she had been trained to expect a first kiss to be. It was not tentative or polite or conducted according to any particular social protocol. It was honest, the way he was honest, direct and steady and warm, and it tasted like the particular relief of something that has been restrained for a long time finally being allowed to happen. When they broke apart, she kept her face near his, looking up at him. "The ranch needs considerable work," she said. "I noticed," he said. "The south fence line is in poor repair. The barn roof needs replacing before spring. The kitchen garden is a disaster. I am reasonably good at fence lines," he said, "and barn roofs. The garden I will have to learn." She looked at him. "Are you saying?" "I am saying," he said carefully, "that I would like to stay if that is something you are willing to consider. I understand it is complicated and I will not pretend otherwise. I am still going to Wichita in March for the Drummond testimony, and the Colorado matter is not resolved, and I am what I am. But I am also telling you that I have not wanted anything this much since I was 19 years old and your father looked at me and told me I was worth something." He stopped. "I want to be worth something. To you." Dorothy Fletcher stood at the fence of her father's ranch, in the clear winter light and looked at Alfred Holloway, outlaw, promised man, the best thing her father had ever left her, and said, "Stay." He stayed. The spring came in early that year, warm and gold, and the creek that ran through Fletcher Creek Ranch ran clear from the snowmelt just as Alfred had remembered. The Drummond testimony went exactly as Marshal Tate had outlined. Alfred appeared before the territorial court in Wichita in March, and gave his testimony with the precise, unembellished clarity that turned out to be its own kind of credibility. And Drummond was convicted, and the 2 Kansas warrants were formally dissolved. The Colorado matter took another 4 months, and a formal petition supported by Tate's office, and Elias Webb's careful documentation of Alfred's role in recovering the fraudulent documents, and it was resolved in July, with a letter from the Colorado Territorial Governor's office that Alfred read 3 times before he folded it and put it in his inside coat pocket. He showed it to Dorothy that evening at the kitchen table. She read it and set it down and looked at him, and the relief in her eyes was the kind that goes very deep, the kind that relieves things you had not admitted to yourself you were afraid of. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he agreed. Silas Fletcher was indicted by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office in February, tried in Wichita in April, and convicted of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 4 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. Judge Harlan Beaumont resigned his judicial position in January, before the indictment reached him, and left Cimarron County entirely. Where he went, Dorothy did not trouble herself to find out. Raymond Cass, who had cooperated with the prosecution and provided testimony against both Beaumont and Silas, received a reduced sentence of 2 years. Elias Webb set up a proper law office in Cimarron Crossing and was elected county attorney the following year, a development that made Dorothy genuinely happy because he deserved it entirely. Old Pete Mabry came back to work the ranch, which he claimed was only temporary until his knee improved, and was still there 3 years later, which surprised no one. Dorothy planted the kitchen garden in April, the spring after everything had been resolved, on a warm morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were budding pale green. Alfred worked beside her, which he was decent at, better than her father had been by a fair margin, and the garden that summer was the best the Fletcher land had seen in a generation. They were married in June of 1879 in the small church in Cimarron Crossing, a quiet ceremony attended by Mrs. Hargrove, Elias Webb, Pete Mabry, Mrs. Aldrich from the boarding house, and approximately half the town who came anyway because Cimarron Crossing did not generate this specific combination of frontier legal drama and love story very often, and people felt they had earned the right to witness the ending. Alfred Holloway stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had clearly purchased for the occasion, and which fit him better than any piece of clothing she had ever seen on him. And he looked at her when she came down the aisle with something so open in his face that several of the town's older women were seen to dab at their eyes. Dorothy Fletcher wore her mother's dress, which Pete Mabry had found carefully wrapped in a cedar chest in the attic of the ranch house, as if her father had been keeping it for exactly this. She thought about her father during the ceremony. She thought about what he had known and what he had planned, the long invisible thread he had drawn from his own life through Alfred's bad decisions and good character, through 10 years and 1 stolen deed and 2,000 acres of Kansas grassland, to this particular moment. She thought about how he had been an extremely perceptive man and had also been, it turned out, quietly optimistic in a way she had not understood until now. She said her vows to Alfred Holloway, and he said his to her, and the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and he kissed her in front of the whole town with considerable feeling and no particular care for protocol, and the older women who had been dabbing at their eyes earlier had to find fresh handkerchiefs. In the years that followed, Fletcher Creek Ranch became exactly what it had always had the potential to be. Alfred turned out to have a particular talent for cattle, which surprised neither of them, and under his management the herd grew from the small, neglected operation Silas had reduced it to, back to the full productive ranch her father had built. He was fair with the hands and exacting about the land, and he never asked anyone to do work he would not do himself. And gradually, over years, the town of Cimarron Crossing replaced the name it had used to know him by with the name Dorothy had known him by from the beginning. Their first child was a boy, born in the spring of 1881, whom they named William after her father. He had Alfred's dark hair and Dorothy's expression of determined inquiry, which Alfred said would either produce a future attorney or a future trouble, and Dorothy said both were excellent outcomes. Mrs. Hargrove stood as godmother at the baptism, and wept in a way that was entirely unlike her usual stern self, and which she described afterward as a simple respiratory difficulty, convincing no one. Their second child was a girl, born 2 years later, whom they named Ruth after Alfred's mother, whom Dorothy had never met, but about whom Alfred had told her enough that she felt she knew the shape of the woman who had tried very hard in very difficult circumstances. Ruth had Dorothy's red-brown hair and Alfred's dark eyes, which was a combination of coloring that caused considerable comment in Cimarron Crossing, all of it admiring. There was a third child in 1886, another boy, dark-haired and loud and apparently convinced from birth that the world owed him its full attention, whom they named James, and who would grow up to be the kind of person who needs a great deal of space to contain himself, which Fletcher Creek Ranch, with its 2,000 acres and its clear-running creek and its stubborn kitchen garden and its bay horses, had more than enough of. On a summer evening in 1887, when the light over the Cimarron Valley lay long and golden across the grass, and the creek was running clear, and the kitchen garden had produced more tomatoes than 4 adults and 3 children could reasonably consume, Dorothy sat at the fence with Alfred as they had sat at that fence so many times, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the land. The children were somewhere behind them, performing acts of energetic chaos that she was choosing, for 5 minutes, to let Pete Mabry manage. Alfred had his forearm on the top rail, and he was looking at the horizon with the same expression she had known on her father's face, the expression of a man who is grateful for what he has built, who does not take it lightly, who feels the weight of it in his chest like something precious held carefully. She put her hand on his arm. He turned and looked at her, and there was everything, the dark eyes and the scar along his jaw and the weather-worn face, and beneath all of that the person who had climbed through her window on a November night with a folded piece of paper and a promise he had kept, who had been worth something to her father and who had made himself worth everything to her. She thought about the deed. It was in the ranch house now, framed on the wall of her father's study, which was her study now, beside her father's photograph. Fletcher Creek Ranch, Dorothy Ann Fletcher, 1869. The document that had started everything and saved everything and connected everything. She had shown it to William, their eldest, the previous week, explaining to him at 8 years old the outline of what it had meant. He had looked at it with the focused attention of a child who was going to need all of it, explained again in 10 years when he was old enough to understand the full weight, but who could sense even now that it was important? "Grandpa's writing," he had said, pointing at the top corner. "Yes," Dorothy had said. "And your name," William had said. "My name," she had agreed. He had looked at it a little longer and then looked up at her with his father's eyes. "Will it always be ours?" he had asked. She had thought about fraud and forgery and the specific wickedness of men who believe that power entitles them to take what belongs to others. She had thought about old registrar secretaries who remembered what they had typed in 1869. She had thought about dark alleys and folded papers and the promise her father had known how to leave in exactly the right hands. "Always," she had told her son. Now she sat at the fence in the summer evening with the man she loved and listened to the sound of their children somewhere behind her, alive and real and insistently, wonderfully present. And she thought that her father, standing at this fence in his own time, looking at his own horizon, had understood something she was only now fully understanding herself, that the things worth protecting are worth protecting at considerable cost, and that the protection, if you are fortunate, arrives wearing an unlikely face. She leaned her head on Alfred's shoulder. He put his arm around her. Somewhere behind them, Pete Mabry said, "Young Mr. Fletcher, do not," in the specific tone of a man who has been outmaneuvered by an 8-year-old, and young Mr. Fletcher apparently did anyway, judging by the subsequent sound of running feet and Pete's resigned exhalation. Alfred made a low sound of amusement in his chest. "He's going to be a problem," Dorothy said. "He's going to be magnificent," Alfred said. She laughed and turned her face up to his, and he bent and kissed her forehead, and the sun went long and red over the Cimarron Valley, and the creek ran clear, and the 2,000 acres of Fletcher land lay gold and living all around them, and everything that had been taken was restored, and everything that had been hidden was found, and the promise made across a decade, and a folded piece of paper was kept, entirely and completely, just as it had always been meant to be.